David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we had a first sight of this bill on the 10th of September this year, not last. 3 days later, we had our first reading, and in those 3 days, we looked at the bill as much as you can in a few days, and frankly, we saw no harm in it. We saw no massive benefit, nor did we see a great deal of harm. We thought there was a possibility this new proposed entity might do some good, and so we supported through to the Select Committee. We entirely agree it is important that we seek to increase the strength of the direct links between science, research and actual commercial activity. We are very much in favour of a clean tech, green tech economy. That is the way of the 21st century, unlike some of the government's policies that are leaping forward into the early 19th. We see that this is an important and necessary thing to do, to increase our output in the high-tech sector. The question that has since come to us in terms of the proposal to establish this ATI, this Advanced Technology Institute, is quite a simple question. It's simply to ask the question, well, why? What is actually the need for such an organisation? What gap does it fill? What is the necessity for an entirely new entity, a new structure, rather than working within existing structures, existing sets of relationships, perhaps enhancing those, making them work a little differently or better? What is so wrong with the IRL, the institute which to date is effectively doing what this new entity is supposed to do? If one has a look at the statement of intent for the current year to June 2013, the objectives and strategic goals of our IRL are fundamentally the same as what is proposed for this new ATI, for this new organisation. I must say it seems that this government seems to have a very peculiar relationship with the public sector. And I must say in passing, I was equally surprised and somewhat amused at the chair of the committee launching into the Labor Party for daring to suggest that the unions might be represented on the board of this entity. The people who represent, or the representatives of the scientists, the technicians, the tradespeople who actually design and make stuff. How dare they propose that they should be represented on a body who will make key decisions about linking the science and the outcome, the economic and social outcomes. But more particularly, this government seems to have a perverse situation. They're putting the boot into the public sector. In the name of so-called efficiencies, they're actually taking away the capacity of the public sector to do its job. And yet, when it perceives a problem, it tends to create a new entity, a new public sector entity. It did it with a productivity commission acknowledging that we have a very low productivity economy. Let's create a public entity to try and solve it, which to date it has clearly failed to even address the key issues, let alone resolve them. Similarly with this, we have an issue about not getting enough high-tech, high-value manufacturing. Let's create a new public organisation, a new bureaucracy. Perhaps that'll do the trick. It's a very peculiar response from a government that alleges that it represents the private sector rather than the public. So the submissions we received on the ATI proposal on the bill, and there weren't that many of them, and clearly they were written in haste because they were given really only days, never mind weeks, to come up and prepare them. Nevertheless, they were of very good quality. They were from some very significant commentators, some important players in the sector. And they offered, with one or two notable exceptions, they offered very qualified support. And I do stress the word qualified. Everybody agrees, as the Greens did at first reading, that an entity, some sort of a networking organisation that can bring together our science and research capacity with our good business brains and our good business organisations, that's a good thing. But the qualifications came through, and they tended to follow themes, common issues that came through again and again from the various submitters. These included the likelihood that this new organisation would duplicate and even disrupt existing successful and productive relationships and situations that do already exist. The commercialisation arms of the universities, the members of EDANs, the economic development agencies, that have done some very solid and robust work over a number of years in this area. The committee did agree that the clause 14 of the bill, on prompting particularly from Labor and the Greens, should include the word collaborate. website, just to drive home the fact that this organisation, the new ATI, should demand that we get a high level of collaboration rather than a more top-down hierarchical approach. That was a good step, it was a positive step, and we supported that. It was a necessary step, but it wasn't a sufficient one in terms of endeavouring to avoid almost the inevitability of duplication, of disruption, of what are currently well-functioning and very productive relationships. The world has not been sitting idly by, waiting for this government to create an entity that will bridge the gap, if you like, or to strengthen the relationships between research, science, technology, that creative sector, and the business sector. And of course, business done well is also a creative activity. And we, again, as I say, we absolutely support the principle of doing that. But there has been a great deal of very good work done over a number of years. Nowhere in this bill, it is so loosely drafted, it is so poorly supported by argument that we see nowhere in it any reassurance that it will not come in with size 11 boots and trample all over and disrupt and set back a lot of those very positive relationships that already exist. One hopes that the Minister is even aware of them and that he has considered that, but there's no evidence of that having happened. We asked the obvious question of the committee about what would be the nature of the relationships between ATI and these other incubators, the commercialisation arms and so on. The answer we got was that no decisions have yet been made about how those relationships will be maintained or held. What an entirely unhelpful response that was. The extent to which ATI would become a provider of science and therefore a competitor to the other organisations was also of concern to many of the submitters. And again, I hope nobody will raise the imaginary objection of self-interest. These are senior respected scientists, commentators, who are actually looking at what is good for this country, what is good in terms of achieving the goals of the proposed goals of this legislation. The Dean of Science at Auckland University gave the committee a supplementary submission. He was very concerned that the ATI should function in a predominantly a service role. He suggests that this research function should be a very minor component of ATI's role, and ideally should only occur through the transition period. He went on to say that the arguments that ATI requires a research capacity to fill the gaps that other institutions could not meet are not persuasive and are based on a limited understanding of research and the challenges of working with a high-value manufacturing centre. Concerns about the ATI being both a funding agency and a provider of research. The bill in clause 13(1)(f) tells us simply that the ATI will allocate and administer RS&T funding. The very obvious and logical question for the committee to ask was, well, which funding? How much? How much control will it have over research funding in New Zealand? Again, the response we get back from MOBI: no decisions have been made regarding which funding the ATI will administer because MOBI is currently reviewing the schemes. A report back to Cabinet is due on November 30th, by which time this bill, we expect, will be done and dusted. We are being asked to support a pig in a poke. We don't know what the boundaries of this organisation will be. We don't know what its relationship will be with existing very positive initiatives. We don't know what funding it will control. We suspect it will be a lot. The issue of funding would be less critical if this was an organisation with any autonomy. It is a Crown agent. It must give effect to government policy. It has very little autonomy. This gives the Minister of the Day licence to pick winners. And picking winners was one of those activities that the late great Sir Paul Callaghan directly advised us to avoid like the plague. He was absolutely clear on that point. Governments are very bad at picking winners, and the NZMEA, who have already been mentioned, in their opposition to this organisation, made it clear that picking winners has a dishonourable history of complete failure, and it's very hard to argue with that. I've outlined some of the objections from submitters. I look forward to the committee stage and the third reading. We'll be able to engage a little more. But for the moment, the Greens, given all the flaws in this bill, we see that Labor are supporting it and we respect their decision. We were on a bit of a tightrope as well, but on balance, we cannot support an entity we know so little about, where the legislation is so poorly drafted, where the intention, the operational functions, the role and the powers of this entity are unknown. We therefore will not be supporting this legislation.
Colin King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to take a call.